Get out of first class? Attendant slapped black woman, then froze when she said, I own the plane. It was a crisp morning, and Ava Williams was looking forward to her flight from New York to Los Angeles. The hustle of the airport was behind her now, and as she walked through the jet bridge, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. It wasn't just because of the trip or the luxurious first-class seat she had secured for herself. No, this flight represented something more. Ava had worked hard to get to where she was. She had built an empire from the ground up, overcoming countless obstacles in a world that often underestimated her. And now, she was finally sitting comfortably in one of the best seats on the plane, a symbol of her success. Ava wasn't your typical first-class passenger. She didn't wear a fancy dress or a designer suit. Instead, she wore something simple yet sophisticated, a fitted jacket, tailored pants, and a confident smile that spoke volumes about her. She worked hard for everything she had, and this seat, this plane, was just another reminder of her achievements. As she settled into her seat, the flight attendant, Samantha, approached. Samantha looked at Ava for a moment, a professional smile on her face. Ava smiled back, adjusting her seat and preparing for the long flight ahead. Good morning, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink? Samantha asked politely. Ava nodded, settling in. Just water, thank you, she said, her voice calm and confident. However, Samantha didn't move right away. Instead, she stood there, staring at Ava for a moment longer than usual. Something was off, but Ava couldn't quite put her finger on it. Then, without warning, Samantha's tone changed, growing slightly more insistent. I'm afraid there's been a mistake, Samantha said. This seat is actually not yours. You need to move to another seat. Ava was taken aback. She looked up from her seat, a small frown forming on her face. What do you mean? This is my seat, she said, showing Samantha her boarding pass, which clearly indicated the first-class section. Samantha's eyes shifted from the boarding pass to Ava's face, and Ava could see the tension building in the flight attendant's demeanor. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this seat isn't available. You need to move, Samantha insisted. For a moment, Ava was stunned. She had paid for this seat. It was clearly marked on her boarding pass. So why was Samantha saying it wasn't hers? Something felt off about the whole situation. But Ava didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. She took a deep breath, remembering the countless times she had to deal with situations like this, people doubting her, challenging her. Ava knew how to handle herself. I've already shown you my boarding pass, Ava said, keeping her voice even but firm. I've paid for this seat. I'm not going anywhere. Samantha didn't seem to back down. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at Ava. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, she said, her voice now much colder. Ava could feel the tension in the air, and she could tell that this was quickly becoming something personal. Ava's calm demeanor started to shift. She stood up slowly, looking Samantha directly in the eye. No, I'm not leaving this seat. I paid for it, and I'm staying in it, Ava said, her voice growing a little firmer with each word. The passengers around them began to notice the exchange, and the atmosphere on the plane shifted from casual to uncomfortable. Some passengers shifted in their seats, glancing toward the scene unfolding. Others seemed to watch with curiosity, but no one dared speak up. Samantha's face turned a shade redder, and Ava could see her struggling to maintain control. There was something in the way Samantha held herself, an air of superiority or authority, as if she believed Ava was out of place. But Ava wasn't about to let her intimidate her. She had been in this position too many times, where others tried to challenge her simply because of the color of her skin or the way she carried herself. But she wasn't backing down this time. Not today. Samantha, frustrated and flustered, glanced around the cabin. She wasn't sure how to proceed. Ava was still standing, her posture strong and unwavering, but the situation was growing more awkward by the second. A few of the passengers had pulled out their phones, likely recording the exchange, but Ava wasn't concerned with that. She had nothing to hide. I'm not leaving, Ava repeated, her voice calm but resolute. This is my seat, and I will not be intimidated. The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the back of the seat in front of her. You're causing a disturbance, Samantha said, her voice shaking now. I'll have to report you to the captain. Ava took a deep breath. She had been in situations like this before, but something about this encounter was different. It wasn't just about her having a seat. It was about standing her ground in the face of someone who seemed to believe that people like her didn't belong in a space like this. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about the principle of the thing. She shook her head slowly. I'm not going anywhere. You'll have to speak to the captain. But know this, I don't back down. The room was silent for a moment as the tension between Ava and Samantha filled the cabin. Passengers were watching closely, their attention fully on the confrontation unfolding before them. Ava could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't just about her anymore. She was standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, every person who had been treated as though they didn't belong. And at that moment, Ava knew she wasn't going to back down. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating. Ava stood her ground, her eyes locked with the flight attendant, Samantha, who seemed to struggle with the situation. The tension between the two of them had escalated quickly. The passengers around them watched, some with curiosity, others with concern, but no one dared to intervene. Ava knew this wasn't just about the seat, it was about something bigger. She had seen how people treated her differently, how they looked at her because of the color of her skin, and how they often underestimated her. But she wasn't going to let that happen today. Samantha, still standing in front of her, appeared unsure of how to handle the situation. She glanced around at the other passengers, perhaps looking for support or reassurance, but she found none. Ava remained calm, her voice steady, but her words sharp enough to convey her determination. You can call the captain if you want, but I'm not moving from this seat, Ava repeated, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't raising her voice, but there was something in the way she spoke that made it clear she wasn't going to be pushed around. She wasn't going to allow anyone to treat her as though she didn't belong. Samantha took a step back, as if reconsidering her approach. She looked at the seat assignment again, perhaps doubting her initial claim. Ava could see the flight attendant's hands trembling slightly as she shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure of what to do next. Her professionalism had all but evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of panic. Ava had already figured out what was going on. Samantha was uncomfortable, not just because of the confrontation, but because Ava wasn't the type of person she was used to seeing in first class. The truth was, Ava wasn't like most passengers. She wasn't a well-known celebrity or someone who walked into a room expecting to be treated like royalty. Ava had worked hard for everything she had. She was a businesswoman, and her success was something she had earned. She wasn't here because of her family's wealth or connections. She had fought her way to this point, and that perhaps was what made people like Samantha so uncomfortable. Ava's success wasn't something they could easily dismiss. It wasn't something they could ignore. As Ava stood there, Samantha turned and walked away, presumably to fetch the captain. Ava could see her walking down the aisle, talking to a couple of other flight attendants. Ava was left standing there, staring at the back of Samantha's head as she disappeared into the galley. Ava wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know if the captain would side with her or with the flight attendants. But she did know one thing: she wasn't backing down. She had earned her place here, and no one was going to take that away from her. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling longer than the last. Ava looked around at the other passengers, who were now whispering to each other. Some seemed to support her, others seemed uncomfortable, but no one seemed to want to speak up. Ava had learned over the years that many people would rather remain quiet than get involved in uncomfortable situations. It was easier to pretend that nothing was wrong and hope it all went away. But Ava wasn't like that. She had always been the type of person to stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. A few moments later, Samantha returned, this time with the captain, a tall, middle-aged man with a stern expression. He walked down the aisle toward Ava, his eyes scanning the cabin. There was no doubt that this was a serious situation, and the captain didn't seem to be in the mood for small talk. He looked down at Ava, then at Samantha, and then back at Ava again. I understand there's been a bit of a misunderstanding, the captain said, his voice calm but authoritative. Ava didn't flinch. She knew how this conversation was going to go. She had been in situations like this before, and she knew the routine. The captain would try to placate her, make her feel as though she was the one causing trouble. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. Not at all, Ava replied, her voice steady. I'm not the one causing trouble here. I'm just sitting in the seat I paid for. There's no misunderstanding. The captain seemed momentarily taken aback by her directness, but he quickly regained his composure. He looked at Samantha, who stood behind him, then back at Ava. Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to move, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. There's been a mistake with your seat assignment. We have to get this sorted out. Ava shook her head slowly. She wasn't going to budge, not now. I've shown you my boarding pass, she said. This seat is mine. I've paid for it, and I'm not going anywhere. If you want me to move, you're going to have to do a lot more than just ask. The captain's face tightened. He wasn't used to dealing with situations like this. Flight attendants and pilots were often the ones in charge in the air, and passengers usually didn't question them. But Ava wasn't the typical passenger. She wasn't going to let herself be pushed around by anyone, no matter their rank or authority. She had worked hard for her place in the world, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The captain paused, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He glanced at Samantha, who looked as if she was hoping he would just take charge of the situation and get rid of Ava. But the captain seemed to realize that there was something more to this than just a simple seat dispute. He could see it in Ava's eyes. This wasn't just about the seat. It was about respect. It was about standing up for what was right. I'm sorry for the confusion, the captain finally said, his voice more sincere now. We'll make sure this is handled, but please, for the sake of the other passengers, can we resolve this calmly? Ava didn't respond right away. She could tell that the captain was trying to defuse the situation, but she wasn't sure if he understood the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was about her being treated with respect, not just as a paying customer, but as someone who had worked for everything she had. She wasn't about to let someone dismiss her because of their assumptions. I'm not moving, Ava said again, her voice unwavering. I paid for this seat and I'm going to stay here. The captain nodded, though his face was still tight with frustration. He turned to Samantha, and for a brief moment the two exchanged a look. Samantha's face was flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't argue. She knew that the situation was slipping out of her control. The captain sighed, looking at Ava once more. Fine, he said, his tone resigned. We'll let you stay here, but I want to make sure we handle this properly when we land. Ava nodded, satisfied for now. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least she had made her point. She had stood her ground, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. As the plane continued its journey, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet victory. This wasn't just about the seat. It was about asserting her place in the world and demanding the respect she deserved. And no matter what happened next, she knew she had made a stand. The minutes that followed were filled with a sense of uncertainty. Ava sat back in her seat, her mind still racing. She had just made her point, but she knew this wouldn't be the end of the story. The tension in the cabin had shifted, and although things seemed calm for now, Ava knew that the flight attendants and the captain were still processing what had just happened. As the plane cruised through the air, the hum of the engines was a constant reminder that they were still in flight. Ava's seat, once a symbol of relaxation and comfort, now felt more like a battleground. She hadn't expected things to escalate this much, but in a way she had been ready for it. She had learned over the years that standing up for herself, especially in situations where people underestimated her, wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Samantha, the flight attendant who had started the confrontation, was nowhere to be seen. Ava assumed she had retreated to the back of the plane, possibly seeking solace with the other crew members. She could only imagine how awkward the rest of her shift must have been, knowing that the conflict had been recorded and was now circulating among the passengers. Ava wasn't sure what would happen when the plane landed, but she knew one thing. The airline had to take responsibility for what had happened, and they couldn't just sweep it under the rug. Ava's thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice came over the intercom. The captain's voice, though still formal, had a new tone, one that was more conciliatory than it had been earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain began, his words echoing throughout the cabin, we apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. We're working to ensure that everyone on this flight is treated with the respect they deserve. We appreciate your patience, and we hope you enjoy the remainder of the flight. Ava raised an eyebrow. It was clear the captain was trying to smooth things over, but his words didn't sit entirely well with her. He had apologized for the misunderstanding, but not for what had actually transpired. There had been no acknowledgement of the way she was treated, no recognition of the fact that she had been disrespected in front of the entire cabin. Ava wasn't expecting a grand apology, but it was hard to ignore the fact that the situation had been handled poorly. As she sat there, trying to process everything, Ava couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come in her life. She had started with nothing. Raised in a modest home, she had been told time and again that she wouldn't make it, that she wasn't cut out for the business world. But Ava had never let those words stop her. She had fought for every opportunity, every success. And now, here she was on a plane, fighting for something far more important than a seat, her dignity. As the plane continued its journey, Ava turned her attention back to the other passengers. She could see that some were still staring at her, whispering among themselves. It wasn't unusual for people to be curious when something out of the ordinary happened, but Ava could sense that they were also trying to make sense of what had just occurred. She wasn't sure what they were thinking, whether they felt sorry for her, admired her for standing up for herself, or simply didn't know what to make of the situation. What mattered to her was that she had made a stand. Despite the awkwardness, Ava remained calm. She had learned a long time ago that maintaining her composure was key in moments like this. She wasn't going to let this incident define her, but she also wasn't going to let it be forgotten. She knew that the situation had the potential to spark a larger conversation, one that went beyond her individual experience. It was about respect. It was about equality. And most importantly, it was about making sure that people, especially those who had been overlooked or underestimated, were treated with the dignity they deserved. A few hours passed before the plane began its descent. The flight had been smooth for the most part, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the tension in the air hadn't fully dissipated. She could still feel the weight of the earlier confrontation hanging over the cabin like a cloud. The flight attendants had tried their best to avoid her, and Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at that. She hadn't come here to make enemies, but she wasn't about to let anyone disrespect her either. As the plane landed, the captain came over the intercom again, announcing that they were about to touch down in Los Angeles. Ava gathered her things and fastened her seatbelt, mentally preparing herself for what would come next. The flight attendants were likely already preparing to deplane, but Ava had no intention of letting this issue slip away unnoticed. Once the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Ava stood up, carefully gathering her belongings. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her again, but she didn't mind. She was used to being watched. What mattered was how she carried herself. She walked down the aisle with confidence, ignoring the whispers that followed her every step. As she passed the flight attendants, she made sure to meet their eyes, letting them know that she was still very much aware of what had happened. As she made her way off the plane, Ava was met by airport personnel. She was expecting the usual "thank you for flying with us" routine, but this time she didn't expect the warm reception she had become accustomed to. Instead, one of the airline's customer service representatives approached her, a look of concern on their face. "Ms. Williams," the representative said, "we've been informed of the situation. I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience you experienced today. Please, allow me to escort you to our customer service desk, where we can discuss how we can resolve this." Ava nodded, her mind already processing the next steps. She wasn't sure what kind of resolution she was expecting, but she knew that this was far from over. This was bigger than just one incident. She was going to make sure that the airline took accountability for what had happened, not just for her, but for every passenger who had ever felt like they didn't belong. It was time for the conversation to shift, and Ava was ready to lead it. As she walked through the terminal, she knew that this experience would follow her in the coming days. The media would pick up on the story and her name would be in the headlines, but Ava wasn't afraid of the attention. In fact, she welcomed it. This was her chance to make a difference, to use her platform to spark change. And no matter what came next, she was prepared to face it head-on. As Ava walked through the bustling terminal, the weight of the situation still lingered. The story was far from over, and although she had made it off the plane, she knew that the real work had just begun. The airport personnel had escorted her to a private area, away from the prying eyes of other passengers. Ava was grateful for the space, but it didn't take away the feeling that everything she had experienced was just the beginning of something larger. Sitting in a small, somewhat sterile office in the airport's customer service section, Ava had a few moments to gather her thoughts. She had expected this to be a simple flight, a few hours of peaceful travel before getting to her destination. But now, everything had changed. What had started as a disagreement over a seat had spiraled into something that would have ripple effects across her entire day, and perhaps even longer. The representative who had greeted her earlier now stood in front of her, nervously shifting from foot to foot. He was a younger man, probably in his mid-20s, with an earnest look on his face. He introduced himself as James, a senior customer service manager. His presence was a contrast to the tension Ava had felt on the plane. James seemed genuinely concerned, his eyes wide with sincerity. "Ms. Williams, once again I apologize for what happened today," James began. "We take matters like this very seriously, and I want to assure you that we will investigate what went wrong." Ava nodded but said nothing at first. She appreciated the apology, but she knew that words alone weren't going to fix the problem. This wasn't just about her being treated unfairly. It was about ensuring that no one else would face the same disrespect, no matter their background, no matter who they were. "I appreciate the apology, but words don't change the fact that I was disrespected in front of everyone on that flight," Ava finally said, her voice steady. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to let the matter go without addressing it directly. "This isn't just about me, James. It's about making sure that people, anyone really, are treated with dignity. It's about holding your staff accountable." James listened intently, his eyes never leaving Ava's face. He seemed to realize the gravity of what she was saying, and the more he heard, the more he understood. Ava could tell that he wasn't just going through the motions. He seemed to genuinely want to find a solution. "We'll investigate the actions of the flight attendants involved and make sure that this doesn't happen again," James assured her. "We'll also review the training and procedures for our crew to make sure that all passengers, no matter who they are treated with respect." Ava appreciated the words, but deep down, she knew that simply reviewing procedures wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a matter of just fixing a broken system. It was about changing the way people thought. It was about instilling a culture where respect wasn't a luxury, but a given. "Thank you for that, but I want more than just a review," Ava said, leaning forward in her chair. "This goes deeper than just the flight attendants. This is about the culture you've built in this company. If employees can treat customers like that, especially someone like me, then there's a bigger issue at hand. Your company needs to change how it views its customers. It needs to ensure that no one feels less than." James seemed to take her words seriously. He nodded, then sat down in the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right," he said after a moment of silence. "I'm sorry if we failed to make you feel respected, and I agree, just reviewing policies isn't enough. There needs to be a shift in the way we approach customer service, one that prioritizes dignity and equality. I will personally make sure this is addressed at the highest level." Ava appreciated his willingness to engage. She wasn't sure if it would lead to immediate change, but at least there was some recognition of the problem. She had dealt with many people who brushed aside issues like this, pretending they didn't exist, but James wasn't doing that. He was taking responsibility, and for that, Ava could respect him. "I'm glad you understand," Ava said, her tone softening slightly. "But this isn't just about an apology. It's about ensuring real change. I want to see your company take action, and not just internally. I want this to be a conversation that other people hear. I want people to know that your company is committed to respect and equality, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the foundation of any successful business." James nodded again, clearly absorbing her words. "I'll make sure this issue is elevated. I'll report directly to our senior leadership team, and we'll begin implementing new programs to address this kind of situation." Ava wasn't sure if the company would follow through. It was always easy to promise change, but harder to follow through. She had seen countless companies issue statements and apologies, only for things to go back to the way they were. She wasn't naive. She knew that true change took time and effort. But she was willing to push for it. She wasn't going to let this slip away, and she wasn't going to stop until something meaningful came out of this experience. "I don't want to hear about this happening again," Ava continued. "It's not just about me, it's about everyone. No one should feel like they're not welcome or that they don't belong. If you want to change your company's culture, it starts with small actions, everyday interactions. You need to make sure that everyone, staff and customers alike, feels valued. That's how you build loyalty. That's how you create a company people can believe in." James looked at her for a long moment, and Ava could see that her words had made an impact. He wasn't just nodding along anymore. He was truly considering what she had said. Ava wasn't looking for sympathy, she was looking for change. And whether it came today or tomorrow, she knew she had made a difference just by standing up for herself and speaking her truth. "Thank you for your honesty," James said after a long pause. "I promise you that we'll do everything we can to ensure this never happens again. We will reach out to you with updates, and I'll make sure your voice is heard in the highest levels of our company." Ava stood up, satisfied with the conversation. She wasn't going to leave with all the answers, but she had taken the first step toward making sure that her experience wasn't just forgotten. She had started a conversation, and she was determined to see it through. As she walked out of the office, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had ignited a conversation that had the potential to create lasting change. This wasn't just about one incident on a plane. It was about creating a culture of respect and equality. And as she walked out of the terminal, she knew that her work wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. As Ava made her way through the busy terminal, she could feel the weight of the day starting to settle on her shoulders. The confrontation on the plane, the meeting with James, and the promises of change had all led her to this point. She had done what she set out to do, stand up for herself and make sure that her experience wasn't just forgotten. But now, as she walked through the airport, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. She had been on the plane just a few hours ago, the tension still fresh in her mind. Now here she was, walking through the airport in a quiet, reflective mood. The airport, once a bustling and chaotic space, now felt calm to her. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade away as she thought about everything that had happened. She had expected a simple flight, a few hours of rest, but instead, she had been thrust into the center of a situation that demanded attention. Ava wasn't one to shy away from challenges, but she also wasn't naive enough to think that her journey was over. She glanced at her phone, noticing several missed calls and messages. The media had already picked up on the story. Her name was starting to spread across social media, and the incident on the plane had become the subject of conversation. Ava had never been one to chase the spotlight, but she knew that this moment was different. It wasn't about her, it was about something much bigger. It was about sparking a conversation on a much larger scale. It was about making sure that no one, no matter their background, ever felt like they didn't belong. Ava decided to sit down for a moment, taking a deep breath as she looked out at the busy terminal. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The media was already involved, and she knew that this story would only gain more traction. The question on her mind now was simple. What could she do with this attention? How could she use her platform to ensure that the conversation didn't end here? Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was an email from James. He had sent her an update on the situation with the airline, and the tone of the message was different. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore. It was about action. The airline had begun its internal review process, and James had promised to keep her updated as the investigation progressed. He also mentioned that the senior leadership team would be discussing the issue in their next meeting, with a focus on making the necessary changes. Ava appreciated the update, but she wasn't ready to let go just yet. She knew that the real work would be in the follow-through. Companies, especially large ones, often promise change but failed to deliver. This was the moment where Ava's influence could make the difference. She wasn't just going to let this be a moment in time. She was going to ensure that the changes she demanded were implemented, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a reporter at a major news outlet. Ava had a decision to make. She had the opportunity to go public with her story and share her experience with a larger audience. This could be the moment to speak directly to the public, to raise awareness about the importance of respect and dignity in every interaction. The reporter's message was polite, asking if Ava would be willing to do an interview. They had already seen the video footage from the plane, and now they wanted to hear her side of the story. Ava hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she wanted to turn her experience into a media spectacle, but she also knew that this was her chance to spark change. If her story could inspire others to stand up for themselves, to demand the respect they deserved, then maybe it was worth sharing. Ava took a deep breath and decided to respond. She agreed to the interview, but with one condition. She wanted to make sure that the conversation focused on solutions, not just the problem. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about ensuring that the conversation didn't end here. She wanted to use this moment to highlight the importance of creating a culture of respect, one where everyone, regardless of their background or status, felt valued. The interview was set up for the next day, and as Ava made her way to the studio, she felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She had always been a private person, and she wasn't used to being the center of attention. But this wasn't about her, it was about the message. She wasn't just going to talk about what happened on the plane. She was going to use her platform to speak for those who didn't have a voice. When she arrived at the studio, the crew was already setting up, the cameras in place, and the lights were bright. Ava took a seat, and the reporter introduced herself with a warm handshake. She was a seasoned journalist, professional and prepared. The interview began, and the reporter wasted no time diving into the details of the incident. Ava shared her experience calmly, explaining what had happened on the plane. She described how she had been treated, how she had stood her ground, and how she had refused to let anyone disrespect her. But Ava didn't stop there. She used the interview as an opportunity to talk about the larger issue, about how important it was for companies to create a culture of respect, not just for their paying customers, but for their employees as well. As a businesswoman, I understand the importance of building a strong, inclusive culture, Ava said in the interview. And that means making sure that every person, no matter who they are, is treated with dignity and respect. It's not just about being polite, it's about truly valuing people for who they are. The reporter listened intently, nodding along as Ava spoke. Ava wasn't just talking about herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt less than, everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as she spoke, Ava could sense that this interview was resonating with the audience. By the end of the interview, Ava felt like she had said everything she needed to say. She had shared her experience, but more importantly, she had used the platform to advocate for change. She wasn't just sharing a story, she was starting a conversation that she hoped would lead to real, lasting change. As the interview concluded, Ava left the studio feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had done what she set out to do. But she knew that the real work was still ahead of her. The media attention would die down, and the airline would eventually finish its investigation. But Ava wasn't going to let this moment slip away. She was determined to continue pushing for change, for a world where respect wasn't optional, where everyone was treated as equals. As she walked out of the studio, Ava knew that her journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The days that followed the interview were a whirlwind. Ava's story had quickly spread across social media, picked up by news outlets, and shared by people who felt connected to her message. She had expected some attention, but the extent of the response had been overwhelming. What started as a confrontation on a plane had turned into a movement, sparking conversations about respect, dignity, and equality that reached far beyond the walls of the airline. But as the media buzz began to die down, Ava found herself reflecting on the larger implications of what had happened. The attention was nice, but it wasn't the end goal. The interviews, the articles, the tweets, these were all just pieces of the puzzle. What truly mattered was what came next. Would the airline keep its promises? Would the changes she had pushed for actually be implemented? And most importantly, how could she continue to use her newfound platform to make a real, lasting impact? Ava knew that this was the beginning of something bigger, something that could lead to real change in the way businesses, especially large corporations, treated their customers. She had made it clear in her interviews that this wasn't just about her. It was about creating a culture where everyone, no matter who they were, felt valued. It was about ensuring that every person was treated with the dignity they deserved, and she wasn't going to stop pushing for that. As she sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing the emails and messages that had flooded in, Ava's phone buzzed. It was another update from James, the customer service manager at the airline. She had been in regular contact with him since the incident, and while she didn't expect an immediate solution, she had been hoping for some concrete progress. The email was short, but it carried significant weight. The airline had completed its internal review and had already begun implementing new training programs for its staff. James mentioned that they were also working with a third-party diversity and inclusion consultant to ensure that the changes were not just surface level, but were deeply integrated into the company's culture. This was the kind of action that Ava had been hoping for, but she knew that it was only the beginning. True change would take time and sustained effort. Ava sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had made a difference, and while the road ahead would require persistence, this was the first step. But she wasn't about to stop there. She knew that this platform, the attention she had received, could be used for even greater purposes. Ava wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a leader, and she had the power to influence others to stand up for what was right. Over the next few weeks, Ava was invited to speak at several conferences and events, where she shared her story and advocated for systemic change. Her message was simple but powerful. Respect wasn't just about politeness. It was about making sure everyone felt equal and valued. She spoke about how companies, no matter their size, needed to look inward and examine their own cultures. Were they truly treating their employees and customers with respect? Were they fostering an environment where diversity and inclusion were prioritized, not just as buzzwords, but as fundamental values? Ava's message resonated with many people. She received letters from individuals across the country, telling her how her story had inspired them to stand up for themselves in their own lives. Some had faced similar situations, while others had never considered the importance of standing firm when they were treated unfairly. Ava realized that by sharing her experience, she wasn't just talking about an isolated incident. She was igniting a conversation about how we all deserve to be treated, no matter where we came from or what we looked like. But even as Ava felt proud of the progress she had made, she knew that the fight wasn't over. The media coverage had died down, but the conversation needed to continue. She couldn't let the momentum fade. So she decided to create something lasting, something that would continue to inspire and encourage others long after the headlines were forgotten. Ava founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting diversity, equality, and respect in the workplace. She named it Voices of Dignity, with the mission to provide resources, training, and support for individuals and businesses looking to build inclusive, respectful environments. The organization would offer mentorship programs for young people of color, helping them navigate careers in industries where they were often underrepresented. It would provide workshops for companies to help them build more inclusive teams and ensure that every employee felt valued. The nonprofit quickly gained traction. Ava was able to bring in experts from various fields, diversity consultants, HR professionals, and leaders in the corporate world, to help guide the initiatives. It wasn't long before several major companies reached out to collaborate with Voices of Dignity, wanting to improve their own workplace cultures. Ava knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a powerful start. As she stood at the podium at the launch event for her organization, Ava couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had started with a simple flight, a misunderstanding, and a refusal to back down. Now she was leading an organization that would help shape the future of workplace culture for generations to come. She wasn't just making a difference for herself. She was helping others, giving them the tools to stand up for themselves and make their voices heard. The crowd applauded as Ava finished her speech, but she wasn't focused on the applause. She was focused on the impact she was making. This was what mattered: the work, the change, the progress. Ava knew that it wouldn't always be easy, that there would be setbacks and challenges along the way. But she also knew that she was on the right path. The fight for respect and equality was far from over, but Ava was ready to lead the charge. As she walked off the stage, Ava felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had used her experience to create something bigger than herself, and she was determined to keep pushing for change. The road ahead would be long, but Ava was ready to continue fighting. She had made a difference, and she wasn't going to stop until every person, regardless of their background, felt truly respected and valued.